What's one family saying or phrase you heard growing up that still sticks with you?
Do you know your true worth? I broke every rule and won. Yesterday, my sister hijacked my graduation dinner, and this morning, I posted something that made her call me furious. But to understand why that phone call felt like the first breath I had taken in years, you need to hear how the whole thing unfolded from the very beginning, because the truth is, nothing in my family ever happens by accident. Not even who gets to speak first when glasses are raised. Graduation was supposed to be mine. I had worked for years, juggling 2 part-time jobs, pushing through nights when I thought I couldn't make it, and living with the constant pressure of being the first in my family to actually walk across that stage with a diploma. My parents, of course, made sure we had a dinner reservation at a nice restaurant, something that sounded like support, but really, I knew deep down, it was more about appearances than pride. Still, I told myself to accept it, to enjoy the night, to believe, just for a few hours, that I would be the center of attention in my own story. We sat at a long table with relatives who had flown in, cousins I hadn't seen in years, my parents at the head, and me somewhere in the middle because that's where my mom decided I should sit to keep the group balanced. Already, I felt that little sting, the graduate seated like a placeholder rather than the reason we were gathered. But I told myself not to care, to let it slide, because maybe the speeches would make up for it. When the waiter brought the first round of drinks, I stood up to thank everyone, to say something heartfelt about how much it meant to me that they had come. I had rehearsed a short message, nothing grand, just a few lines about resilience and gratitude. But before I could even clear my throat, Madison, my older sister, 3 years ahead of me, the golden child who always got the spotlight without ever really earning it, raised her glass with a bright smile, and in that moment, everyone turned toward her as though they had been waiting. She said, "By the way, I'm engaged." She held up her hand, flashing a ring that I had not even noticed before, and the table erupted into claps and cheers. She waited for the noise to settle, then smirked at me and said, "Guess I stole the moment again." And the word again was the knife, because she knew and I knew that this wasn't the first time. My birthday when she announced she had landed a new job, my high school graduation when she paraded her college acceptance letter, even family holidays where somehow the conversation always ended up circling back to Madison's latest story. This time, though, she didn't just take the spotlight, she did it deliberately, and she made sure I understood that she enjoyed doing it. The waiter, bless him, must have been listening when she shouted her announcement, because not 5 minutes later he walked out with a dessert plate that had "Congratulations" written in chocolate, set down right in front of her. And the entire table laughed and took pictures while I sat there staring at my own barely touched entree. My parents, smiling with pride, were already asking her when the date was, what the plans were, and Ethan, her fiancé, leaned back in his chair like he had just won something. I gave my little speech anyway, soft and quick, because it felt pathetic to sit down without saying it, and the clapping I got was polite, distracted, half the table scrolling through Madison's ring photos already. That was the moment when something in me shifted. I had always been the one to let it go, to tell myself that family dynamics are what they are, that I would rather keep peace than start a war. But sitting there, watching her bask in applause at my dinner, I decided I was done playing background music to someone else's show. So I stayed quiet, smiled when people turned my way, and waited. When the bill came, I asked the waiter to bring it directly to me. It wasn't cheap, but I had saved enough from my jobs, and paying it felt like a statement. I didn't announce it, I didn't make a scene, I just handed over my card. The only thing I did differently was this. When the server tried to include Madison's celebratory dessert on the main check, I asked politely that it be placed on a separate bill, under her name. He nodded, no argument, and brought it back split exactly as I requested. As people started leaving, hugging Madison and saying goodbye with promises to see her soon, I felt something strange, almost like relief. For once, I wasn't chasing the scraps of attention left over after her spotlight faded. I was watching her carry her own dessert plate and her own bill out the door. If she wanted the spotlight so badly, then she could start by owning the tab. And that was just the beginning. The night after the dinner, when the dishes were rinsed and the last relative had posted a filtered photo of Madison's ring with some caption about fate and sparkle and family blessings, I sat at my kitchen table with the kind of quiet that does not soothe you but makes you notice the leftover noise in your own head. And instead of spiraling over what I should have said or how I should have stood up or whether I should have called her out in front of everyone, I did something almost boring and absolutely necessary, which was to open the stack of mail I had been ignoring during finals because survival had required tunnel vision, and there was simply no room for anything that did not get me across the stage. Inside the pile was a thick envelope with my name typed in a formal font that made me think of bank lobbies and framed diplomas, and the return address belonged to Alicia Gomez, the attorney who handled my grandmother's estate. A woman I remembered from a quiet meeting years ago when we signed something after the funeral and my mother kept her hand on my back like I was going to fall, which I did not. Because I learned early that I am the kind of person who only breaks where no one can see, and I opened it without preparing for anything more than maybe a tax form or a sentimental letter my grandmother had left behind. Yet what I found was plain and clinical and exactly what I needed. A letter explaining that upon conferral of my degree, a modest education trust in my name becomes immediately available to me, to be used at my discretion for educational costs and related life establishment, released upon proof of graduation, with a note about my grandmother's intent that the first person in the family to finish a degree should not carry debt longer than necessary. I read it twice, slowly, while the old arguments about being grateful and not making trouble tried to climb up my throat, and then I did the thing that breaks the cycle, which is to call the number listed at the bottom. And Alicia answered in a steady voice that felt like a level floor under my feet, and when I told her who I was, she did not act surprised. She simply said she had sent similar letters before, and had been told by my parents that I understood the fund would be used for family needs. A phrase that landed like a glass of water in my lap because I had never been shown anything, never heard the amount, never given the rules, and I asked her to email me the original trust language, which she did within minutes. And there it was in black and white, not vague, not open to interpretation, clearly mine upon graduation, clearly intended to clear loans and help me stand up without borrowing my future from strangers. I sat with that for a long moment, not to dramatize it, but to let it register in a body that had gotten used to shrinking, and then I did what practical people do when the truth shows up wearing credentials. I opened the family group chat and scrolled to last week where my mother had typed something that I had half noticed at the time and now read like a confession. A little line about no worries about deposits once Olivia's graduation clears, followed by a string of heart emojis and a ring GIF, and I realized two things at once, that they had been planning backwards from my accomplishment, and that Madison's timing was not romantic so much as strategically convenient, because vendors love a couple that promises money soon, especially when the word family is attached, and suddenly the dessert plate at my dinner looked less like a cute restaurant gesture and more like a baton handoff. I kept breathing, because nothing good comes from rage on an empty stomach, and I made coffee. And I pulled up Madison's engagement post to check the venue tag, and then I did what any adult can do in 5 minutes with a website and patience. I looked up that venue's calendar notes and saw my graduation weekend sitting under a soft hold with my last name listed as a contact from months ago, a detail that could be a clerical accident or a very convenient nudge someone had offered to keep a date warm, and while I could not prove intent, I could certainly remove my name from anything that suggested I had agreed to underwrite a ballroom. I called Alicia back, thanked her for the clarity, and asked her to initiate the release immediately using the diploma verification the university had posted that morning. And she said she would handle it and send formal notice to prior correspondence so there would be no confusion, and I told her, with a steadiness that surprised me, exactly what I intended to do, which was to pay down my student loans in a single careful sweep and to carve out a small scholarship in my grandmother's name for first-generation graduates like me, because if the money was meant to turn my degree into ground under my feet, then the most faithful way to honor that promise was to stand on it and let someone else step up behind me. While the transfer wheels began to turn in whatever back office they turn, I opened my notebook and wrote a short, factual announcement for the next morning, a simple message that I could post without gloating or apology. Just gratitude for my grandmother's planning, acknowledgement that the trust had done what it was designed to do, and a note that a scholarship in her name would begin the following year. And as I wrote, my phone buzzed with a new message from Madison asking whether I could send her the high-resolution photos from the restaurant because her followers were asking for details on the ring, and she wanted to keep momentum. And I stared at the screen, not angry anymore, just awake. Before I went to bed, I emailed the venue to request documentation on any hold that included my name and to clarify that I was not a party to any booking. Then I forwarded Alicia's letter to my personal email and saved a copy in a folder labeled with my grandmother's name. And I set an alarm for early morning because I wanted to make the post before families started their Sunday routines, and the algorithm buried it under pancakes and church photos, and I felt, for the first time in a long time, that I had stepped onto my own side of the line, not to hurt anyone, not to humiliate anyone, but to stop paying rent in a house I had already bought with my work. If they were counting on my degree to finance her wedding, they should have asked the degree holder. The morning after I had spoken with Alicia and confirmed in clear legal terms that the trust belonged entirely to me, I woke earlier than I expected. Not because I had set my alarm, but because my body was buzzing with a nervous energy that was equal parts fear and something close to exhilaration, and while my first instinct was to wonder if I was in over my head, I quickly realized that the only thing that had really changed was that the curtain had been pulled back and I finally knew what was mine, and once you see something like that you cannot pretend you do not. I dressed quickly, poured a coffee I barely tasted, and drove downtown to Alicia's office, rehearsing in my head how I wanted to present myself, not desperate, not defensive, but direct and steady, because if I was going to take control of this, then the way I carried myself needed to reflect that control. When I arrived, Alicia greeted me with the same calm voice she had used on the phone, the kind of voice that belongs to someone who lives inside fine print and deadlines. And she walked me through the paperwork with the efficiency of someone who has done this 1,000 times, but still knows when to slow down to make sure the client understands. She confirmed my degree with the documentation I had brought, made photocopies, and explained how the transfer would be initiated, which accounts the funds would move through, and how I would receive written confirmation once everything was complete. For the first time in years, I sat across from a professional who had no interest in family politics, no stake in keeping Madison happy, and no hesitation in pointing to the line where my name alone was written. Then came the part that I had half expected but still felt like being punched lightly in the stomach. Alicia showed me a copy of correspondence that had been used to place a soft hold at a venue under my name, with my supposed approval, pending graduation. A document that carried no legal weight but had been persuasive enough for the venue to reserve a Saturday in June. She explained that these holds happen all the time, that vendors operate on trust and good faith, and that while they are not binding, they do carry reputational implications if they are misrepresented. I stared at the paper, at my name typed neatly under the words, primary contact, and thought about how easily my work, my milestone, had been repurposed as a placeholder in someone else's story. Alicia asked me, gently but firmly, what I wanted to do next, and in that moment I realized I had choices that went far beyond saying no or saying yes. I could protect myself legally, I could reclaim my narrative, and I could redirect the money into something that carried my grandmother's name into the future without tying it to Madison's endless appetite for attention. I told Alicia that I wanted to pay off my student loans, all of them, in one calculated sweep, and then I wanted to set aside a portion of the trust to create a small scholarship at my university for first-generation graduates. Something that would honor the original purpose of the fund and make sure the story of what my grandmother left was never rewritten by anyone else. Alicia nodded, typed notes, and assured me she would handle every step with precision. Once that was decided, a strange calm settled over me, the kind of calm that comes not when problems disappear, but when you realize you have stopped begging for permission. I looked out the office window while Alicia printed forms, and I thought about Madison, about how she was probably posting a new set of photos by now, maybe her hand posed over Ethan's shoulder at brunch, maybe a caption about the beginning of forever. And I wondered whether she had any idea that the financial scaffolding she was counting on had just been pulled out from under her. It wasn't satisfaction I felt, not yet, more like inevitability, as though the dominoes had been set up months ago, and I had finally stopped pretending that my row was hers to knock down. When I left the office, I did not go home immediately. I drove to the University Foundation office, walked in with the packet Alicia had prepared, and spoke with the coordinator about establishing a small scholarship in my grandmother's name. The coordinator seemed genuinely touched, and as she explained the process for selecting recipients, I felt a flicker of something warm that I had not felt the night of my graduation dinner. A quiet acknowledgement that what I was doing mattered and would continue to matter long after the ring photos disappeared into a feed no one scrolled back far enough to see. By the afternoon, the transfers had been initiated, my loans were set to be cleared within days, and the scholarship paperwork was in progress. I went home, opened my laptop, and drafted the announcement I would post the next morning, careful to make it factual, gracious, and precise. I wrote that my grandmother had left a small education trust for the first in our family to graduate, that I had used it to pay down my loans, and that a scholarship in her name was being created to support future first-generation graduates. I did not mention Madison. I did not mention my parents. I did not hint at the fights or the lies. I framed it as gratitude and legacy, because I wanted the contrast to do the work for me. Before I shut my laptop, I opened the email from the venue confirming the soft hold under my name, and I typed a short response, that I was not a party to any booking, that I requested my name be removed immediately, and that any further arrangements would need to be made directly by the paying client. I pressed send, sat back, and exhaled. It was a small action, but it felt like snapping the final thread of a rope I had been tied to without consent. The sun was dropping low when I finally allowed myself to lean against the counter, staring at the pile of papers Alicia had given me, each stamped and initialed, each carrying my name in ink that no one else could erase. Tomorrow the announcement would go live, tomorrow the world would know, and tomorrow the fallout would begin. But for tonight, I allowed myself one steady thought. The calendar only has one night, and now it finally had my name on it for real. At 9 in the morning, while most people were still halfway through their first coffee or scrolling absently through news headlines, I pressed the button to publish the announcement that I had drafted the night before. And within minutes I watched as the words traveled farther and faster than I had expected, not because the text itself was particularly dramatic, but because it carried a kind of weight that people could feel. A clarity that was almost disarming in how simple it was, and in a world that feeds on spectacle, simplicity sometimes slices deeper than any attempt at fireworks. I had written plainly that my grandmother had left a small education trust intended for the first in the family to graduate, that I had used it to erase my loans and place my future on solid ground, and that in her honor I was establishing a scholarship to help future first-generation graduates find their own footing without being trapped by the debts that so often keep people like us from moving forward. There were no digs, no sarcasm, no thinly veiled references to anyone else, just gratitude and the kind of pride that does not boast, but also does not hide, and that combination struck exactly the chord I had hoped it would. By mid-morning, professors I had barely spoken to in class were resharing it with notes about perseverance and grit. The university itself posted it on their main page with a line about the power of legacy. And friends sent me screenshots of their parents commenting things like, "What an incredible young woman, and this is what family means." I sat there, staring at my phone, feeling the irony that this was the first time my name alone had carried the story forward without being attached to anyone else's event or announcement, and I could almost laugh at the timing. Because while Madison had carefully choreographed her reveal to maximize attention, I had simply told the truth about what was already done, and the truth does not need a ring light or a filter to travel. It did not take long for the silence to break. My phone rang, Madison's name flashing across the screen, and I almost let it go to voicemail, but decided that if this was the storm I had been waiting for, I might as well walk outside and meet it face to face. Her voice came through sharp, brittle, already wound tight, and she accused me of sabotaging her engagement momentum, of deliberately overshadowing her announcement with something designed to make her look selfish. She said that vendors had begun reaching out, asking for deposits now that the so-called family fund had apparently been used up, and that Ethan was furious because they had promised payments based on assurances from our parents. The part that made me clench my jaw, though, was when she said, without hesitation, that I owed her this, that as her sister it was my responsibility to step up, because family shares. I let her talk until she ran out of words, and then I told her in the calmest voice I could manage that it was my graduation fund, not a wedding fund, and that I had used it for my graduation exactly as it was intended, nothing more and nothing less. She did not like that answer, and she threw back every guilt-laden phrase she had stored over the years, telling me I was ungrateful, selfish, short-sighted, and even cruel for making her biggest moment look like a footnote. I repeated my single sentence again, because I had learned that repeating the truth is sometimes more powerful than arguing against a lie, and then I ended the call before her shouting turned into begging, because I was not going to let her drag me back into that endless loop where my worth is measured against how well I can prop her up. Not long after, the family group chat lit up, and while I had expected some division, what struck me was how quickly the sides were taken. My father tried a neutral approach, saying we all needed to communicate better, as though poor communication was the root issue rather than manipulation, while my mother was less subtle, accusing me of acting without consideration for how this would affect the family as a whole, because to her, family had always meant Madison first and the rest of us as supporting cast. I did not argue. Instead, I sent a screenshot of Alicia's letter with the clause that named me explicitly as the beneficiary, the one person the trust was created for, and then I set the phone down. The chat went silent for hours, and in that silence I found a strange satisfaction, because for once the facts spoke louder than the excuses. By late afternoon, I decided to make my next move, not out of spite, but because I knew momentum matters, and if Madison thought she could bully me into backtracking, then I wanted her to understand that every step I took was intentional and irreversible. I reached out to the nonprofit that worked with young women aging out of foster care, a group I had admired for years, and I offered them my backup banquet reservation for their graduates, a Saturday night in June at a beautiful venue that they had never been able to afford. They were stunned, grateful, and almost suspicious at first, but when I explained that I wanted no publicity, no name recognition, just a clean transfer that would let their students celebrate properly, they accepted with tears in their voices. In that moment, I knew that whatever Madison lost was not my burden, because what I gave away would ripple outward in ways her curated spotlight never could. That night, I sat at my kitchen counter, scrolling through notifications, ignoring Madison's increasingly frantic texts, and I thought about how quickly a narrative can shift when someone decides not to play their assigned role. The engagement that was supposed to dominate our family's story had already been eclipsed by something real, something permanent, and while she could keep posting photos and hashtags, the truth was that my announcement had landed with a weight hers never could. Families can deny a lot, but they cannot deny public receipts, and mine were clean, precise, and unimpeachable. When I turned off my phone and finally allowed myself to breathe, I realized that the revenge I had wanted for so long was not about taking something from her, but about reclaiming what had always been mine. Tomorrow there would be new battles, more fallout, and more demands, but tonight the scales had tipped, and for the first time I was not the background. The spotlight had shifted, and it was not because I fought for it, but because I had built something solid enough that it could not be stolen. And as I leaned back in my chair, I smiled at the thought that when the photo lights went off, the invoices turned on, and the only people left scrambling were the ones who thought my life was their stage. The morning after Madison's furious phone call and the heavy silence in the family group chat, I woke with a sense of clarity that felt unusual for me, almost unnatural, because normally I would spend hours replaying every word, doubting myself, and imagining how to smooth things over so no one stayed angry. But this time I realized that I had crossed some invisible threshold where there was no going back, and once you step onto that side, the old habits of apology and retreat stop fitting like clothes you finally admit were never made for you in the first place. The calls kept coming, her name flashing across my phone again and again, alternating with text messages that shifted wildly from accusations to guilt trips to sudden pleas that sounded almost rehearsed, but I did not answer. Because I knew that the moment I stepped into that conversation, I would be dragged back into the cycle where my achievements became bargaining chips for someone else's comfort. By midday, the messages shifted tone, and this time it was my mother who reached out, her words dressed in politeness, but sharpened with expectation, asking whether I might consider moving the nonprofit banquet since it had apparently complicated Madison's wedding plans. As though my quiet donation to a group of students who had no one else in their corner was nothing more than an inconvenience that should be adjusted to make room for Madison's perfect moment. I read her text several times, my chest tight, because this was the script I had known my whole life. My needs were negotiable, my milestones optional, and Madison's comfort untouchable. But I finally typed back one word. A word that had cost me years of swallowing it. A word that felt almost foreign in my mouth and yet powerful in its simplicity. No. The silence that followed was louder than anything she could have written, but I did not rush to fill it, because I knew that learning to hold your ground means letting others sit with their disappointment. Later that afternoon, I met with Alicia one last time, and she confirmed with her steady precision that the trust was officially closed in my name. The funds had been fully transferred, the scholarship paperwork had been submitted, and there was nothing left for anyone else to reassign or reinterpret, because the matter was settled both legally and financially. She handed me copies of every signed document, neatly organized, and for the first time I felt a kind of finality that no family argument could unravel, because the truth was stamped and filed in a way that could not be undone. A few days later, I invited my parents to meet me for coffee, not because I thought we could solve everything, but because I wanted to set the terms clearly, out loud, so there would be no confusion about where I stood. I told them I loved them, and I meant it, but I also told them that I was done being the family discount, that I would no longer play the role of the reliable one who absorbed disappointment so Madison could shine, and that if they wanted me at future events, the price of admission was respect, plain and simple. My father nodded, my mother frowned, and I could see in their faces that they were not ready to hear it, but that was no longer my problem, because clarity is not about making others agree with you, it is about making sure they cannot pretend they did not know. The nonprofit banquet went ahead without a single hitch, and when I walked into the venue briefly that evening, I saw rows of young graduates dressed in borrowed gowns, holding plates of food with wide smiles, and the director pulled me aside to thank me again, her eyes shining in a way that needed no explanation. I stayed only a short while, because it was not about me, but as I stood in the back and listened to one of the students speak about what it meant to be celebrated without strings attached, I realized that my grandmother's gift had rippled outward in a way even she might not have imagined, and that this, more than any ring or ballroom, was what legacy should feel like. I left quietly, slipping out before anyone could make a fuss, and for the first time in weeks, maybe years, I walked back to my car without feeling like a shadow trailing behind someone else. A week later, Madison posted new photos, this time announcing a smaller venue and a different date, her caption carefully worded about choosing intimacy over spectacle, as though it had been her plan all along, and I did not comment, I did not share. I did not even send the link to friends, because the truth was that I no longer needed to engage in the performance at all. The power of revenge, I realized, is not in destroying the other person, but in removing yourself from their stage entirely and letting them stumble when the script they wrote no longer has a supporting character to play my role. Before the summer ended, I received a letter from the university confirming that the scholarship had been officially created in my grandmother's name, with the first award scheduled to be announced the following year on the same weekend as my graduation. And they asked whether I wanted to attend the ceremony as the donor family. I told them yes, but only on one condition, that my presence be quiet, no speeches, no spotlight. Just a seat in the back where I could watch someone else's name called and know that the ground they were standing on had been laid by the choices I had made in the middle of my own family storm. That night, I sent Madison one final text, not cruel, not mocking, just a line that said, "When you are ready to celebrate people as they are, I will be there." Then I muted her thread, not because I hated her, but because I refused to let her noise drown out my own life any longer. I placed my diploma in a simple frame, set it beside my grandmother's photo on the kitchen counter, and stood there for a long moment. Not thinking about Madison's smirk at my graduation dinner, or my mother's disappointed sighs, or the endless comparisons that had haunted me, but about the fact that I had finally claimed space that was mine without apology. Families rewrite their stories every day, sometimes messily, sometimes painfully, and mine may never look the way I once wished it would, but one thing is certain. I learned that I hold the pen too, and once you hold it, you do not hand it back.